Welcome to the Phronesis Partners podcast, Navigate with Confidence. In each episode, we sit down with our clients and other thought leaders to discuss how they and their own customers use insights and data to illuminate, validate, and navigate their paths to growth and competitive success. We welcome you to join us as we uncover and explore the unknown so that business leaders like you can navigate your own opportunities and challenges with speed, accuracy, and confidence.
Hi, everyone. I'm delighted to be joined by Paul Nesbitt to provide his first-hand observations, point of views, and future expectations on how we should be approaching market research when it comes to Gen Z. Just some quick intro about Paul. Paul is the Global VP of Research and Insights at Condé Nast. He's a seasoned leader with deep expertise in consumer insights, and he's a contributor to the ongoing discussions on all things Gen Z. His insights are instrumental in helping brands engage with both current and future generations. Paul previously have held leadership positions at Twitch, driving consumer-centric decision-making. So Paul, welcome, and looking forward to our discussion today.
Thank you for having me, and thank you for that wonderful introduction. It sounds so good when I hear somebody read it.
Great. Right, so let's dive in. Let's start with a broad clarification question, Paul.
Yeah.
So everyone talks about Gen Z and how different Gen Z is from other generations. And there are a lot of reports which talks about that, right?
Mm-hmm.
What does that really mean? How should we interpret that? And I'll explain what I mean by that. So when we see results which talks about how Gen Z is different, should we interpret it as how is someone different today from other generation? Or do we interpret it as how is someone today different from older generation when they were of that age? So in a sense, are we comparing, as an example, is a 27-year-old different than a 35-year-old today? Or are we comparing, is a 27-year-old today different than somebody who was 27-year-olds when in 1981, let's say?
Yes, that's a good question to start with, and I think the way I look at it when I look at generations, I think each generation is uniquely different in some shape or form, and I think they tend to be different on an attitudinal level. They certainly tend to be different on a behavioral level, and I think what makes each generation, I would say, different is it's normally particularly the perspective I look from as well. It's normally the macro behaviors which are influential when they're growing up or at that time. But I think more recently and more importantly, the technology which is available, which kind of changes their overall kind of behaviors and how they engage with stuff. And for someone like me who's kind of spent a lot of time in the media world, I think the technological differences and the technological influences is what I tend to focus on, what's driving the behaviors. I can give you a couple of examples of this. I mean, when I look at kind of millennials and what makes them so different, they were the first digital generation, as we love to call them, and I think they're more inclined to go to Google and then search for something and then go to a website. And if they are using social media, they tend to prefer Facebook or they tend to prefer Instagram. If you compare that to, say, their boomer parents love reading newspapers. They love watching linear TV. They love having content curated for them because that's the media experience which they grew up with. And then we get into Gen Z. They're really into online community because there's a lot more community social spaces for them kind of online. They're a bigger gaming generation than what we've seen before. I think upwards around 90% of them are classified as kind of gamers. And I think they're more likely to go to TikTok to search for stuff. And they're more likely to go to their peers for content and information as well. And I think that's just the behaviors which I look at. I think attitudinally, again, I see something different when I'm looking at Gen Z compared to the millennial cohorts, for example. So they tend to vocalize more in terms of kind of their actions and vocalize around the causes which they're passionate against. So you see things like diversity and climate change. They talk about a lot because they feel it's their responsibility to change the world. If you're a Gen Z person growing up, well, let me take a step back. If I'm talking about climate change and I think about how it's going to impact me, I'm there going, okay, this is I'm probably going to have a few more hot summers for my latter years, but really I'm not going to see the severe changes of what climate change could do to a planet. Whereas a Gen Z person is starting to think about, wow, you know, there's going to be some serious impacts in my lifetime, which is going to impact when I'm going to be alive. If you see some of the news stories and the trajectory we're on, so that now implores them as a generation to be a lot more active about it and want to change things than the generations which preceded them as well. So, yes, they are different. I think at a needs level, what these generations are going for, what they need or want from content, that doesn't change. I want to be entertained. I want to learn and that type of stuff. But their behaviors and their attitudes does make each of these generations quite unique.
Great, thank you. Let's expand on that and look at and challenge that as a counter, right? So, proponents of generational research, Pew Research Center, have said that they're not going to be looking at generational analysis unless there is historical comparable data. And the risk is because of stereotyping and making wrong assumptions about generations, right?
Yeah.
And the trouble is, so in a sense, if you want to compare 27 years of today to 27 years born in 1981, you need to be able to have comparable data. And, for market researchers and brands, agencies, consulting companies, etc., the challenge is that you may not always have historical data on comparable questions. It's hard. In fact, in a lot of situations, it's very hard to have comparable data on same questions. So in that scenario, how do we actually effectively analyze and interpret differences which are based on generational distinction? Because there is no comparable data set to compare these two groups.
There is no comparable data set. I think that's absolutely true. But I guess, and I relate it more back to my world and what I'm doing now, I know that there are very distinct differences between the generations, which can give me an indicator of what behaviors to expect now. So I understand that we can't have those comparison points between, 30, 40 years ago. But when I'm coming into my day-to-day right now, I'm there going, I want to know the difference between these generations and how we evolve our products towards them right now. If I'm thinking about doing my research, it's how do I research these audiences right now? And I understand the point about the comparable and having a comparable data set, but how it impacts my now and reality, I don't think about it that much, to be honest. But what I do kind of take the point in is, particularly when you're thinking about generations, is not behaviors are not locked into generations. So you can't expect Gen Z and all of Gen Z to expect one way, to behave one way, and all of millennials to behave another. I think generations are good indicators of some of the behaviors you would expect within these cohorts, but it's not locked in. And I find that there is actually genuinely a lot of bleed between generations. If you think about how culture is formed, it's normally the youngest generation and the oldest generation, and there is like this exchange of values and behaviors and kind of technology, and that's how the new culture is actually formed. So it's the tension between the two which is actually kind of driving the culture. And what you start to see in this, and the way I look at kind of data sets, I'm there going, hey, some younger millennials or some older millennials have similar behaviors and attitudes as Gen Z. So there is a bleed between these two generations. So from a research point of view, I make my data sets really, really easy. I basically cut the world in half. So I have people who are under 35 and over 35. And in the under 35 cohort, I have people who are kind of younger millennials, Gen Z, Gen Alpha on that side of it. And then on the other side of it, I have kind of those older millennials, the Gen Xers, and boomers to a degree. And whenever I cut my data sets that way, I tend to see the biggest difference between kind of attitudes and behaviors. That's my way of, I guess, negotiating some of the generational bleed you see across there. So I'm not putting people into boxes, but I'm starting to better pick where these behaviors and these changes are most apparent.
Great. That's actually a very good insight, Paul. And I like to talk about what are some of those big differences you see between these two cohorts. But before that, let me ask another question. So in the modern sort of scientific usage, the understanding of the term generation was initiated, or it can be traced back to sociologist Carl Moynihan's book, Problem of Generation, written in 1952.
Mhm.
Where Carl Wyndham actually says that, in fact, he stresses that birth year alone is insufficient to place a person in a specific generation. Rather, the person need to experience and participate in the defining events of that generation, right? Part of what you're explaining, that why generation bleeding, right? The, the challenge is, now we know that if we take just an example of country, we know that the defining events of a generation that a subject has to participate in can be wildly different for different countries. And just using as an example, right?
Mm.
If that is the case, are we right in actually using a standard definition of generations, whichever way we define it, Gen Z, Gen X, or 35, across the country, because it doesn't meet the criteria that they would have experienced the same historically defining,
Yeah.
sort of developments? I'd love to get your take on that.
I think it is. I think you can go across certainly different countries and look at kind of Gen Z in different countries and where they are. And there are kind of nuances as you go across there as well. So that is absolutely true. And like I said, it's for me, generations is an indicator of broad-based behaviors you'll want to see. So when I'm comparing across generations, I'm looking at the broad technology which has influenced them, some of the broad macro factors which have influenced them. I'm not getting down into the nitty-gritty nuance of kind of each generation, making kind of comparisons that way. I think one of the interesting observations, and to not so much counter that, but kind of in the experience, particularly when you look at those younger generations now, there is something different in their exposure to online content and media. The world is a lot more connected than it was 10, 20 years ago. So nowadays, somebody who is kind of based in London can have exposure to multiple cultures and multiple people around the world based on the communities that they're engaged with. And I think one of the biggest and most interesting things I saw in some of the research we did back when I was at Twitch, when you started to see that actually, yes, people are no longer divided by language anymore because you've got a generation of people who communicate through imagery and emojis. So all of a sudden, somebody who speaks Chinese or Mandarin, sorry, and somebody who speaks Italian can communicate in the same community. So they're communicating through a common base language of imagery. So all of a sudden, your world and the values and experiences of Gen Z and the dividing lines we used to see between kind of markets and cultures again are starting to blur as people get more exposed to this as well. So I think that is one of the bigger changes we're starting to see among Gen Z, and I expect that to get a lot more pronounced as we get into Generation Alpha, who is, a generation who've just grown up completely connected in online environments and online communities as well. So I think for me is one to watch, because I think there's going to be less differentiation between markets than what we would have seen in previous generations, who were a lot more isolated from the rest of the world.
Great. No, thank you. Makes sense. I'm very keen to pick on some of these findings that you've seen.
Yeah.
Years of research at Twitch and Condé Nast, you've been studying this market for a long time. What are some of the most defining differences you are seeing, whichever way you classify it, younger generation? One you mentioned is truly fascinating, which is languages are now no more a barrier for a certain generation, up to a certain extent. That's fascinating stuff. What are some of the other defining things you're noticing?
I think there's this interesting, people talk about the word authenticity and use the word authenticity a lot, and how these generations gravitate towards authenticity. I'm going to take it a step a little bit higher. And the thing which we're noticing now is Gen Z connect to people better than they do to brands, which is a bigger change of which we've seen in previous generations. Because if you think about, I'm going to go millennials, probably Gen Xers, and even the way we used to gear up research surveys, it was all about brands and these aspirational beacons that consumers used to look at towards. And now to this younger generation, I heard one of our Gen Z panelists talking about it 2 months ago. Brands are faceless entities, and I don't really know what a brand kind of stands for. So I think what we've started to see now, as amongst this generation, is they're more likely to connect to people because they find them more relatable, they find them more human. They're more likely to connect to people in kind of earned experience, and we see this play out in kind of different parts of media and news. I don't know if anybody's seen the latest Reuters news reports, and they talk about how younger generations are gravitating more towards kind of creators for their news content now. And it's not so much that they think creators are better than kind of news organizations. If they're talking about kind of some of the conflicts which are going on in the world, they'd rather get the perspective of somebody who is actually close to the conflict or living in that country and giving that perspective because they think it's more human and relatable. And this now this doesn't extend into content. It's like purchase recommendations. I'd rather buy from that person who I know has similar lived experience to me or similar needs to me. So this thing we're wrestling with a generation is like, how do you become a person, because these brands have just become these faceless entities which people don't know what to stand for, don't know what they stand for, don't know what they mean. So brands have got to think about how do you utilize that. I think there's definitely this demand to kind of play and interact within brand spaces, which we've never seen before. So brands usually, broadcast content to people or create content for people. And one of the things we're now seeing amongst Gen Z is this desire to just create within brand spaces. I can't remember what survey it was I saw many months ago, but I think it was like 81% of Gen Z consumers would love brands to give them their IP to play and create within those spaces as well. So you're seeing this change in kind of how they want to kind of engage with content. And I think the third thing, which I always keep quite mindful at the moment as well, is they tend to gravitate towards brands or people who match their own personal value sets as well. So whatever this generation are interested in or they're most passionate about or they find most important, they will gravitate towards brands or people who kind of reflect those values. They're a lot more choosy about the brands and the people they engage with.
Great. Yeah, sorry, please finish your thought. Sorry, go on.
No, I was going to say, in a nutshell, it's kind of those three things. So when anybody talks to me about these audiences and what's different, I said start in those three areas. If you understand those three principles, you can create content or go and research these audiences.
Right. Yeah, no, makes sense. What about skepticism? So I'll tell you what I mean by that. So we did some research, and obviously there's enough talk about, the sensitivity of younger generation towards doing the right thing and, caring about, the world at large, and it's for them to act on it. And one thing we found, and I'm sure there is a lot of research which talks about that, is it's, the difference between what they say and what they do. When you are asking questions around, your sensitivity towards sustainable product versus when you actually look at purchase data, you see big difference. And we were trying to investigate that. And one of the things that we found was, and I'm overgeneralizing, I'm very conscious of that, but one of the things that we found was that there's a level of skepticism in a younger generation in trusting what the brands put out in terms of their green shadows. They often feel that it's a means and way to sort of circumnavigate the issue at hand and try to have a little bit of posturing rather than real substance. Are you seeing any evidence in your research on that the more younger generation is more connected, more informed, hence more skeptic? Or is that something you haven't noticed? I'm keen to get your reaction to
all of those things, right? So I mean, they're a generation who've been let's say trained. They've been overexposed to information from a very, very young age. Like when we were probably growing up many, many, many years ago, we didn't have such overexposure to the news because the news would be in a paper format and our parents would be reading it and we'd be playing and having fun. But you're talking about a generation who've come up kind of exposed to kind of real issues from a younger age. So, and I wouldn't say they're particularly I think that's probably a more informed generation than what we've seen previously. So they've got access to more information. So of course they're a lot more critical and skeptical in some cases. And I think alongside it, you see some research around kind of there's a lack of trust in kind of authority, which is happening. They're a lot more kind of skeptical about kind of big brands saying things but not kind of fulfilling with the actions, because they can now see if these brands are doing what they say they used to do. It's not an advert on TV saying we do X, Y, and Z. You can see behind the scenes the organization, that's actually what's happening. So I guess it comes back to a fact that actually if you are not authentic or kind of true to yourself as a brand, this generation will sniff it out. And I think in the best case scenario, they'll walk away from you. In the worst case scenario, you'll become a meme and everybody will know as a brand what you're doing wrong, and the whole internet will find out about it. Which, so yeah, I think that is true. I think they're a lot more informed and a lot more kind of skeptical about kind of the content. But like I said, it's not, a lot of people kind of confuse this with a generation being like too serious, and they're not a serious generation at all. Like the content they produce online is a lot more, I'm going to say sarcastic. It's more kind of ironic and it's quite fun. And if you fall on the wrong side of that skepticism, then you will go into that ironic and fun bucket and then become the meme for them.
That's interesting. No, it makes sense. Are there any sort of areas you see your research? Has it indicated any areas or any topics which you find the younger generation to sort of, engage more with? Are there specific interest areas that you've seen?
Uh, Engage more with. I'm just trying to think of in terms of what they engage more with. I mean, when I'm talking about kind of content, and particularly amongst these audiences, I don't like, they like stuff, they like cooking, they like sports, they like all the normal content which we would not like, we would normally talk about and put out to different consumers. But the way, like I said, I think the difference is just the way they want to interact with it. That's really, really important to them. So they need it to be gamified, interactive. They need to kind of have a voice in there, which is kind of quite important to them. You can go into kind of areas like, which are more pronounced amongst this generation, which we talked about, around kind of like climate, diversity, very, very, very important issues for this generation. So we can certainly see those amongst these generations. But for me, it's not so much the areas they lean into; it's the way you converse with this generation, which is most important.
When you say it's more prominent, again, just for clarity, do you mean it's more prominent when comparing to an older generation today, or is it more prominent to younger
Yeah.
generation in the past?
Yeah. I'm always comparing to kind of generations which came before them, and it's like, okay, it's just every generation had kind of different issues, right? I remember kind of Generation X kind of came onto the scene, and I'm thinking about kind of UK club culture, which was like a huge coming out moment for a generation where people started, as part of club culture, and if I remember some of the books I was reading, started integrating with it. Kind of broke down some of the barriers between kind of people from different diverse backgrounds and people sort of coming together kind of in those moments. So, as a generation, there was an awareness of diversity and kind of segregation. And like, I remember the UK club culture kind of broke those barriers down for kind of a lot of people. Whereas when you come fast forward to kind of like the millennials and kind of Gen Z, the diversity conversation has changed. It's not about kind of breaking down the barriers per se. It's more about fair representation and making sure that kind of everybody is included in those different areas. So I guess in a way that in those areas, like, it was important for both kind of generations, but how it was, I guess, not so much solved, because those areas are not solved, but how people kind of dealt with them and kind of made their stand and gravitated towards making the world, or gravitated towards kind of facing those issues and kind of I'm not. I guess I'm trying to find a word which doesn't say, because I know these issues are not resolved kind of in culture or anything like that. But the way they kind of just dealt with them and kind of addressed them certainly was different.
Makes sense. And going back to your previous example of how you look at under 35 and over 35, is that something you see fairly by and large holding true across countries and region, or do you have like a toolbox of, right, so if it this set of markets, I look at a different cohort, if it's different set of
Yeah.
market?
No, I don't, and I think you have that need always, particularly when you're looking at research, to kind of look at those broader macro behaviors. Like I said, there's a layer of nuance you will go down into where it stops kind of making sense. But if I'm looking at
Right.
kind of media behaviors and technology behaviors, broadly that rule kind of plays out, and that's when I start to see most of the differences. I think the interesting difference is when you go across kind of different countries, like the age of some of the population in some of these countries, because like, you go in the UK, yes, you've got kind of Gen Z and kind of younger millennials in there under 35s, but you've also got a huge older audience in there. Whereas you
Mhm.
go into countries like kind of India, China, Middle East, much younger population. So what in the UK is kind of more emerging behaviors in the younger populations, it's just more prominent behaviors as well. But it's really, really interesting because we've tried to, and like I said, I look at the world through a narrow lens, right? I look at the world through kind of a bit of a media and an entertainment and a technology lens. So if I gravitated outside of those areas, I might be exposed to a lot more cultural nuances. But when I
Right.
sit in these areas, and I remember some of the research we were doing, particularly when I was in the Twitch world, actually, and we did a lot of research amongst Gen Z. Some of our research studies, we'd compare results between Brazil and Japan, and we'd have the US in there, then we'd have a European market, and we always decided if the behaviors were different in those four countries, which culturally can be very, very, very different, then there would be a difference there. But we saw a lot more unifying behaviors when we look at those younger generations and how they engage with content, then we actually saw differences. So yeah, so that yeah, I
That's a
guess
great.
yeah. Going back to your question, yes, there are nuances, but if you look through that narrow lens of media behavior and what I've seen before, then actually there are a lot more unifying behaviors that you will find.
That's a great point. You have more commonality. Don't try to find the differences. Look at the commonalities between. Yeah, that makes sense. That's great. Let's talk about research. Obviously, Gen Z as a cohort is super important. I was reading about it. I think Bloomberg cited data from Gen Z Planet that just in US, Gen Z is accounting for $360 billion a year in
Yeah,
spend. So massive, you know, fair. And so it's important to engage with them and hear their views and opinion.
absolutely.
In your experience, what are some of the techniques that you've seen working well when it comes to researching this audience, motivating them to participate in the research? How
Yeah.
do you engage with them? How do you incentivize them? Because I can imagine that your current job as well as in Twitch, I'm sure you've done a lot of engagements targeting this audience. So keen to
Yeah.
get your experience.
Yeah, I think research becomes a little bit trickier because, like you said, you need to think about what matters the most to these audiences and some of the kind of think about how you can add value to these audiences to get them to engage with you, right? So I think one of the challenges I've seen with researching kind of Gen Z audiences is them less likely to be on research panels. So I think if anybody's done research amongst these audiences, it's very hard to find these people. And that's just because, like I said, going to website based experiences for millennials is a natural behavior, and kind of the older generations that are slightly older. When you think about these younger audiences, they spend a lot more time on social, they're less likely to go to like these browser based kind of websites as well. So I think that is a bit of a challenge. And like I said, I think when you're researching Gen Z audiences, I think there needs to be a clear value exchange. So, they'll give you their opinion, but they want to know that it will kind of impact or kind of make a difference in what they're going to do as well. So you need to think about that feedback loop, or you need to think about how you would kind of engage them beyond sending kind of a survey to them. If you think about what I said about brands have just become like these faceless entities to these younger generations in some way, and they don't know what they mean or what they stand for. I mean, if you think about kind of survey technology, giving your opinion to these set of questions which turn up in your inbox, and it's again this same kind of faceless entity, and you don't know what the information is being used for, it's a lot less appealing for this generation. So when I do tend to kind of interview them, a lot of the stuff I tend to use methodologies which tend to be a lot more community based, using kind of Gen Z community based platforms. And there are partners and vendors out there who are able to kind of build those for you or kind of run them themselves. And I think normally why they're run so well is usually because they're managed by people who are actually Gen Z themselves, and they set up these community platforms. And only in kind of that scenario, first of all, you can like have a proper conversation with them so they can see the two-way conversation. They can also discuss topics with their peers, so it feels a little bit more community based, and they can see where their opinions are being validated. But also in those environments, sending questions and kind of surveys in there, you get a kind of much richer response than I would see in kind of traditional panels. So I think when you're thinking about Gen Z and kind of like building surveys for them or kind of survey strategies, I think about that value exchange, what you're doing and why it's kind of relevant to them, because you can capture them in surveys, but there are definitely environments which I think are a little bit better, and they tend to be more kind of community-based environments for researching this audience. And I think another thing I tend to use as well, I think the thing which people don't realize about Gen Z audiences, younger audiences, or culture right now, is it's moving at a rate faster than I can acknowledge, because I'm not part of that cohort. I'm a part of a much older cohort. But the fact that culture is kind of moving so fast, and Gen Z audiences are creating kind of right in that culture right now, I tend to lean into a lot more cultural experts and inside professionals to help me understand where culture is going, because then I can start to predict generational behaviors. And particularly for me, when I'm there going, okay, everyone wants to talk about Gen Z right now, that's brilliant. But in 2 years' time, we need to start thinking about Generation Alpha. So if I can start using more cultural insights, and I can start to see what's happening in 2 years' time, rather than trying to chase the tail of Gen Z right now when their culture is evolving on a daily basis as well. So I tend to use a lot more around that, but I'm not taking surveys off the table. I think you just need to think really, really carefully about how you use surveys and that value exchange when you can engage those audiences.
Great. Follow-up technical question. So is it almost sensible to think about, if you have a study which requires to get views from older generation, younger generation, and the whole lot, is it almost sensible to think about it in a way that you have a certain methodology that works for one cohort of people, and then other, like you could do a survey with some specific segments, but for some other segment, you might get more, richer data if you use a community-based approach, and then you bring it together. Is that?
Yeah. I think for me, I do think when I'm in the over 35 audience, I'm more than happy to use traditional panels and traditional methodologies, and what that audience has been used to absolutely kind of works. I think when it gets into Gen Z, even if I'm running that same survey, using something more qualitative, more community based, to get some context alongside that to explain what I'm seeing, kind of add values in there. But like I said, even if I was to target Gen Z with a survey now, I was thinking about this morning, actually. I was there going, because I knew you were going to ask me about surveys and research. And I was there going, how would I create a survey for a Gen Z person? And I actually kind of like noted it down in terms of kind of what I would do. And I think the first thing I would do, the first point I came in was being, okay, if it's going to a Gen Z person, make it more interactive, immersive, and gamified, because I think that will start to get their attention. I think, as I touched on, that kind of value exchange piece is really, really important. And I think about, and this is probably not the best example because I'm not the target audience, but I think about some of the interactive quizzes I see. Now, for my sins, I'm a Liverpool FC supporter, and I go and follow a lot of Liverpool FC news, and I see it all over the internet. But the things what engage me now with surveys is they have these little quizzes where you can pick your best 11 of the weekend, and then you choose it, and it's an interactive quiz. But before giving you the results, then they ask you a couple of branding questions in the middle of it, and then give you a results which you can compare to other users. And I think, yes, that's kind of aimed at people like me, but that is the best reflection of an interactive gamified experience, I would say, for a Gen Z person, because you've made it interactive, but then there's this value exchange of knowledge, which makes it worthwhile for them to engage in it as well. And I think the other thing I would think about when I'm writing it is like, how do you make it highly personalized to them? So talk about, why they needed to answer this specific set of questions, focuses on why their opinion will really impact something that they actually care about. We all put those wonderful lines in a survey, which is like, your opinion really matters and it's really going to have an influence on these products, which is too fluffy. In this area of highly personalization, if we have a panel and we know something about these people, then let's make it really personal in the invitation. It's like, we are asking you these questions because you love cakes. And we know that you love cakes. And actually, by answering these questions, you'll be able to help us design the best cake for Marks and Spencer's, whoever that might be. Just make it really kind of personal. And I think if I was to ever, not to ever, because I do surveys against Gen Z, but if I was using those kind of traditional approaches, I would think about building all of these into my survey approach to kind of engage them nowadays. But like I said, I tend to gravitate more towards the community experiences just to give me that little bit of flavor and depth of those audiences.
Great. On the point about personalization, are you seeing use cases of AI and how it's helping in creating hyper-personalized content for audiences to, engage them?
Am I seeing it? I'm seeing a lot of talk about it, which, if I'm fair, but I do think it will get there. I think I've as with many other people, I've got my eye on AI right now, right, and seeing where it's kind of adding value. And I think amongst the younger generations, particularly some of the research I've seen, they're more likely to be using it. They're quite highly likely to be kind of using it within kind of shopping experiences or to help them plan stuff. There's a lot of kind of utility-based tasks around there, which is kind of supporting at the moment. And when people use it for utility-based tasks, they're finding value in it, or they're saying it's kind of better experiences. So I think it's not going to be too long before it kind of helps people find content which they're kind of into. I think that blurry other area of AI where people talk about it actually creating content, I don't see any indicators which are suggesting that people are all of a sudden going to be super gravitated towards AI-based content. I think that human element is always going to be incredibly important and add that kind of value on it. But the ability to find stuff you're interested in and kind of find stuff which is to your personal taste, yes, I think that's going to be that's AI is certainly going to play a role in that.
Sure, makes sense. And what about honorarium and incentives? How does that play out with the younger generation?
What incentives?
Uh-huh.
Oh, well, you mean for just taking survey incentives and taking part in there? Like I said, that value exchange is more important than monetary incentives. So this, let's say, like traditionally in the past, right? We'd say, hey, here's a survey and here's $1 or whatever it may be. Thank you for kind of taking part. But if you take a step back and think this generation are going to give you their opinion if it's personally relevant to them, it's something they care about, then you're kind of sidestepping that need for incentive. So I think it's more about kind of, to your point, that making it more kind of personally relevant, a lot more kind of personalized in your approach to them, and make sure you're talking about something they actually care about, and that is going to kind of gravitate people towards kind of research. Like I have people come in and talk, Gen Z people come into my office and talk all the time, not all the time, but we've done it a few times. They just love the experience and kind of giving their opinion. Like, it's not a hugely kind of incentivized experience. It's more about the kind of conversation and being able to have kind of an impact on the things they love as well. So, like I said, yes, I don't think there's a way you could get away without having an incentive in there, but don't make that the focus. Make the value exchange and what they're getting out, make it that the focus.
Sure, makes sense. Yeah, no, that's super helpful. Final question. If you have to give, your final takeaway or advice to brands looking to engage with Gen Z, what would be, let's say, top 3 or top 5,
Right.
whatever you can? Yeah.
I was going to go with top two, but we'll see if we can string it out a little bit as well. So, okay. So engaging with those audiences. I mean, if you want to engage with a younger audience, the first thing you need to do is understand who you are and what you stand for. And who are the people who can kind of represent your brand to kind of engage with this audience. And this is going back to that point around which you made around kind of skepticism as well. I think Gen Z audiences understand when brands are being insincere or when people are being insincere to them. So I think it's really important if you understand who you are as a brand and what you stand for and what your values are, and you don't hide behind them, you kind of just put them out there in the world, then I think that is the best way you're ever going to get these audiences to kind of connect with you, because then you can they will identify with you, they will understand kind of what you stand for, what you mean, they will see values in you that they associate with themselves as well, and you're going to build much kind of better connections with them, and you'll get a lot more love from them for being your real self. So I will say to anybody, just kind of start there in those two areas, understanding who you are, and then also making sure that you have that kind of front and center in your proposition through the people who kind of represent your brand and your marketing comms, and you will build a real deep connection with this audience. But if you get that wrong, like I said, the risk is you're going to become a meme on the internet, and that may be good for your branding if you're just trying to drive awareness of your branding, but it's a hard road to come back from.
No, makes sense. And I think it's a great point. You mentioned earlier this acknowledgement that we are not part of that cohort. We are,
Yeah.
older than that. That recognition to bring in that voice in helping shape that up is actually pretty
Yeah.
instrumental, which often we have not seen. A lot of discussions are happening by non-Gen Z or thinking about how Gen Z is behaving.
Yeah.
So I think it's important to bring that.
I think that's a really good point, and I think one of the things I try to do within my team is kind of elevate the younger generations within the team into the decision making. So traditionally within an organization, you have more senior people in the decision making and more kind of junior team members who are kind of supporting those senior decision makers. But I think the thing you need to understand about this generation is particularly they know how to write the best content for this generation. They know what kind of chimes for this generation, and bringing them more into the decision making process allows you to kind of connect with these audiences much better. I've talked about Gen Z for kind of years, but I don't ever see myself as an expert for creating experiences for them. I would rather bring in somebody from that cohort and have them do that kind of on my behalf rather, the older generations have the experience and the expertise in the business now, so that's kind of great, but make sure that you bring them into the decision makers. And that kind of reminded me of something. I think it was one of the case studies I was reading. Kind of Gucci did this many, many years ago when they were trying to reconnect with millennial audiences. And one of my favorite examples of that, I remember reading the case study. I've got it was a few years ago, but they talked about when Gucci kind of transitioned from that traditional luxury brand into the cool brand we saw that it was sort of, in the last kind of couple of years, and how it kind of connected with audience in an authentic way. That was part of a strategy where they started bringing younger voices into the decision making. It was kind of millennials at the time, and having them not have control over products, but have more of an input in terms of the products and the marketing and how you reach consumers. And all of a sudden, I remember seeing Gucci kind of go from the more classic traditional brand to this brand which is really connecting with kind of younger audiences as well. So that's kind of the best example I've seen of brand bringing younger voices into the decision making. And I think that example is even more prominent today when the gap between generations is a little bit wider than what we saw between millennials and Gen X.
Great. No, thank you. I'm conscious we are running out of time, so I'm going to focus on a question that's popping up. How relevant is the construct of generations when you think about business to business? We were chatting about this just before the conversation, so I'd love to get your reaction on this.
Oh my goodness me, yes. I think it is relevant and not relevant in a way. Like the B2B and the B2C lines I find are blurring a lot more now than they ever have been. And I say this is, yes, understanding kind of generational cohorts and what they need and kind of what they value is certainly important when you're kind of engaging with kind of younger audiences kind of within a business scenario. But I think what I'm seeing in this B2B world is certainly amongst younger generations is there are a lot more B2B from a younger age. What I'm saying is, you've got a generation of people who are dreaming about being kind of content creators and kind of entrepreneurs. So they're a lot more business savvy from kind of from a younger age. So I think brands need to kind of understand that, and they need to understand it for many reasons. If you look at some of the futurists are kind of predicting, some of the futurists that certainly I've been talking to as well, they're talking about how younger generations now are a lot more, so that point I made earlier, kind of entrepreneurial, a lot more likely to kind of set up kind of business on their own, and more likely we're going to end up in a scenario where people don't want to work for brands anymore. They want to work for themselves and build their own business around themselves. So what does this mean for kind of brands in the future and how you kind of engage with these audiences? More likely we're going to get into a world where you're going to be employees, you're going to have kind of contractors or kind of partners you're working with as well. And this is more to do with kind of this generational change and kind of the technology they're involved in, and the fact that they can now kind of start to build their own businesses and be a lot more entrepreneurial than a younger age. This is a long-winded way of me saying that there's a lot that the lines are kind of blurring, and I think you need to think of consumers and kind of their needs and behaviors and kind of what they want, and then apply that to a B2C or a B2B scenario, rather than thinking that, I'm in a B2B scenario, so these insights are completely irrelevant to me. It's like they are relevant. You just need to apply them in a slightly different context.
Great. No, makes sense. We are seeing that the expectations is where boundaries are blurring. If you think about B2C or consumers, if you are used to doing your research and ordering an Uber on your iPhone, you tend to carry on that expectation when you move to the business side. Why can't I have a seamless experience and order and make decisions? You take my own time to do the research and then make decisions. So we are also seeing that. I'm worried we have run out of time. So this has been fun, Paul. Thank you so much for sharing some really interesting and thought-provoking ideas. Really enjoyed this conversation.
You're more than welcome. Thank you very much for having me.
Great. Thank you. Bye.
If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe to the podcast and don't forget to follow us on social media for the latest updates and behind-the-scenes content. Stay tuned for more episodes where we will continue to explore and navigate the complex world of B2B sales and more, to provide you with the insights you need to navigate your business decisions with confidence.